Many have speculated on Bitcoin's total addressable market, but have failed thus far to give a proper estimate as to what a Bitcoin chain can actually be worth. So in this video, we will discuss how to go about determining its monetization limits. There are three main factors when attempting to determine the monetization limits of a Bitcoin chain. First, we'll need to find the total value of all money in the world. Then we'll need to determine what percentage of that money can Bitcoin actually represent. And finally, what is the point at which adding higher value transactions on one chain leads to an equivalent amount of value being lost at the lower value range to a new chain due to fee pressure. Before we get into the specifics of this analysis, I'd like to first make a couple of analogies to help everyone get an understanding as to how blockchains scale. Most compare this new decentralized monetary network to other digital networks like the Internet Protocol Stack (TCP/IP), companies like Amazon or Google, or prior monetary networks like the USD reserve system we're currently on today. And although they have some similarities, they do a terrible job of representing the limitations of a Bitcoin's scalability. Although cities exist in the physical world while Bitcoin exists in the digital world, these two networks are very similar in terms of how they grow and scale. In a city, you have a limited landmass in which to develop real estate. When the city is just starting, its land is relatively cheap, but as development of the land ultimately leads to the construction of residential and commercial real estate, transportation networks, ports, recreational parks, etc., the value of that land increases. As the value increases, so does the price as people compete for limited space within the city. Eventually, like we see in major cities like New York City today, some can no longer afford the high rents and move to start new suburbs or entirely new and different cities. Bitcoin is very similar to a city in that in its early stages of network security, when it is only running on a few computers, security is very low, and so one can only utilize the chain to send low-value transactions. Over time, as demand increases, the number of participants operating on the network increases, increasing the utility, market capitalization, and hash rate, thus increasing absolute security. Like in a city where there is limited landmass to work with, Bitcoin has a limited block space where only about 400,000 transactions can fit in a 24-hour period. Just like how rents increase as demand increases to live in a city, cost of transacting over the Bitcoin network increases as individuals compete for that limited block space. Eventually, when the users on the network who primarily transacted in the lower value range can no longer afford to pay the cost to use the chain, just like city dwellers who can no longer afford the high rents, migrate to a new chain. So now let's define Bitcoin's scalability. Scalability is the proportional increase in an aspect of performance as more hardware is employed. Bitcoin transaction throughput is perfectly non-scalable since no amount of hardware increases it. The block size limit consensus rule establishes the arbitrary trade-off between utility and system security, where increased block size increases transaction throughput, but also increases the cost of transaction validation. So as the cost of validation increases, security decreases. We currently have a 1 megabyte Bitcoin block size limit, and so with enough demand, that market for block space becomes competitive, thus fees and security both rise. Now that we have an understanding of how Bitcoin scales, let's get back to the original question presented in the beginning of the video. In order to try and gain a better understanding of the monetization limit of Bitcoin, let's first take a look at the total value of all money in the world. Estimates from the CIA World Factbook in 2017 gave the market for money a valuation of about $100 trillion, but after the nearly 40% increase in the money supply after the COVID stimulus worldwide, we can estimate that total money supply is more around 150 trillion. Now we will need to determine what percentage of the market for money Bitcoin can actually occupy. Many believe it can become the only money, while others believe it can only take a certain percentage of the black market for money. We know that the black market accounts for around 20% of GDP, which would ultimately limit Bitcoin's total addressable market to about $30 trillion. After finding our addressable market for Bitcoin, now we need to take a look at how the fee structure will limit the monetization of a single chain. Let's first take a look at some hypothetical valuations of a single Bitcoin chain and compare them to the security budget in order to get closer in understanding the point at which monetization in higher value ranges will ultimately lead to loss of proportional value at the lower transaction range due to fees. Because we know that fees as a percentage of reward must increase over time as block subsidy decreases, we can estimate the cost per transaction. Let's take a look at a hypothetical situation in which average transaction values on the BTC network are $1 million, calculate its market capitalization assuming an NVT ratio, and then find the cost per transaction given the current ratio of daily security budget versus market capitalization that we have today. So, assuming we have an average transaction value of $1 million and multiply that by 400,000 transactions over a 24-hour period and assume an NVT ratio of 10, we get an estimated valuation of $4 trillion, which would give BTC a price of about $210,000 per coin. Security spend over the last 24 hours was around $36.2 million. If we use the ratio of today's security budget versus the market capitalization, but we assume a Bitcoin market cap of $4 trillion, we get a daily security spend of around $200 million. So if we want to find the cost per transaction, we need to take the $200 million security budget divided by the 400,000 transactions, and we get a $500 transaction fee. Now, if we want to find the lower value bound, or in other words, the minimum transactable amount on the Bitcoin network, we need to calculate the fee ratio. Let's assume people are only willing to spend 1% on transaction fees, and so we take the $500 transaction fee multiplied by 100, which gives us a lower value bound at around $50,000 per transaction. Continuing with our hypothetical scenario, next we need to determine which type of transactions will be monetized by a Bitcoin at this $4 trillion valuation. So we know that our minimum transactable amount is $50,000. It is very difficult to find data on all transactions in the world above this level, especially when we're dealing with unrecorded black market transactions, but potential types of transactions that can occur at this level include real estate, business sales, mergers and acquisitions, large drug or arms trades, high-end car sales, etc. You get the idea. We know that there are far fewer transactions, however, at the higher value ranges, so eventually we will run into a scenario in which security spend rises to cover these higher value transactions while eliminating many smaller value transactions, such that eventually we reach a point where purchasing power remains stable. Looking at the statistics here, you'll notice that in the US alone there were 6.1 million real estate transactions, and since we know the US accounts for less than 5% of the global population, we're looking at over 120 million world real estate transactions. Bitcoin can settle about 146 million transactions per year, which is barely enough to handle just one asset class. This is important to understand because it can give us insight into how multiple chains can be monetized simultaneously and eventually reach similar market capitalizations. It is entirely likely for a second chain to be monetized alongside the BTC chain, but will likely grow at a faster rate, just like smaller cities grow faster because of arbitrage between value and cost. Many will argue that layering can solve this problem of scalability, but this is untrue. Credit cannot scale a money because it is future demand for that money. Yes, you can aggregate and batch transactions through layering, but eventually you must settle in the money or else you have no security from the underlying chain, and settling on that more secure chain isn't economical for all value ranges. Someone must ultimately pay for the security provided by the network, and that has to be people transacting, due to inflation subsidy trending to zero over time. Will inevitably maximize the utility to themselves since individuals are profit-seeking, and they will settle on the chain that minimizes the cost while providing just enough security for their transaction. So back to our original question of what the monetization limit of one chain can ultimately be. Well, since we cannot know exactly the number of transactions per value range, it is very difficult to estimate, but given the understanding of this fee pressure dynamic, it is easy to see that multiple chains will inevitably coexist given sufficient demand. The most secure chain will face slowing growth as it becomes monetized further, and so smaller chains will see higher rates of growth once the first chain becomes mature. This, again, is similar to the growth rate of cities like Singapore and Hong Kong, where once sufficient network effects were established, we see explosive growth. Once a city is established, it becomes more profitable to invest in a new developing city because the rate of growth of the first city slows over time. Similarly, we should expect that the BTC chain will slow as fee pressure rises, so smaller chains should see a similar type of explosive growth Bitcoin did in its early days up until it became mature. This process can continually keep happening over and over again until there is no longer demand for the BTC security model. Some may think that, well then, there will be infinite chains, but this ignores that people must pay to use these chains in order to secure their transactions. There cannot be infinite chains that have similar levels of security because there is not infinite demand for this type of money. So let's recap. It's likely that the total addressable market will be confined to the $30 trillion black market for money. Of that $30 trillion, it is very unlikely that a single chain can take over 50% of that market share given rising fee pressure. And it is entirely possible that multiple chains reach close to similar valuations as people begin to arbitrage security for cost. So while we didn't reach an exact conclusion on how much value one chain can hold, we do understand how these chains will become monetized and grow over time. Let me know what you guys think of this idea, and hopefully we can continue to develop our understanding. This video does show that there is significant opportunity in speculating on new chains, because the market currently does not understand Bitcoin has a much lower monetization limit than everyone expects. I appreciate you guys, and thanks for watching.